Welcome to Agatha Christie She Watched, the spoiler-heavy look at the movie and TV adaptations of Agatha Christie's novels and short stories. I'm Bill Peschel of Peschel Press, and today we're talking about feral playwrights, inquiring reporters, and deadly sugar hammers. We'll be talking about Mrs. McGinty's Dead, the 2006 Poirot episode starring David Suchet as Poirot. And remember, this will be a spoiler-heavy podcast, so be prepared. But before we get into it, let me introduce my partner in marriage as well as crime of the fictional kind, Teresa Peschel. Teresa, how you doing today?
Hi, Bill. It's always a pleasure to be here with you under the stairs. Folks, if my voice sounds a little bit different today, it's because I spent all day Saturday at the Wyoming Peach Festival chatting up total strangers. And we had a great day, and we're here to chat about Mrs. McGinty's Dead.
Right. This is the movie that was done only one time before with Margaret Rutherford as Miss Marple. Remember that?
Murder Most Foul. And if you've watched that movie and think you don't need to watch Mrs. McGinty's Dead, the Poirot version, they are not the same movie. There are hints here and there of the plot, particularly in the play, that there's a playwright involved, but it is really very, very different. Not just because of Miss Marple, but they change around so much that if you think you've seen this film before, you have not.
So this is one of those that takes place in the small village. This is the village-based mysteries that Agatha Christie loves to write in Broadhenny.
That's correct.
And we're dealing with several couples all around the murder of Mrs. McGinty.
She is a char lady. That is, she is a cleaning lady. Even though she is older, in her 50s or 60s, she still spends every day on her knees scrubbing rich women's floors.
So we start out with the murder of Mrs. McGinty and the trial of James Bentley, the lodger who was convicted and he's sentenced to hang. And so we have a TikTok in which Poirot is asked by Superintendent Spence, who ran the investigation. He did not like what he saw. He didn't think that James did it, but all the evidence points that way. And he's asking Poirot to look into it.
It's an interesting setup. Agatha didn't usually do a TikTok like this. Poirot has to come up with enough proof that someone else did it in order to prevent a possibly innocent man being hanged. And as Poirot says to Superintendent Spence, I may discover that Bentley is the murderer. To which Spence replies, that's fine. He just wants to know. But James Bentley as a murderer just doesn't sit well. It doesn't suit his policeman's instincts. This is not the kind of a man who would commit a murder like this. It just doesn't feel right. And yet every single scrap of evidence that he was able to dig up said this was the murderer. And one of the most important pieces of evidence that might have changed the verdict, they couldn't find the murder weapon. Superintendent Spence thought it was very, very strange that the murder victim is sprawled out there in the cottage. No effort whatsoever is made to hide her. There's no effort to clean up the mess. Nothing to say, I didn't do it. The money, everyone in the village knew that she had some savings and it was easy to find. It was hidden so carelessly, and yet the murder weapon itself is nowhere to be found. And if the murderer is able to hide the murder weapon so well, why didn't he do anything to clean up the scene or hide the money better? But he didn't.
Well, she kept the money under the floorboards.
Yes, which Bentley knew, and apparently other people in the village knew too.
Yeah, so he also took the money, went outside, and hid it under a rock by the sidewalk.
And why, if he did that, why if he hid the money so easily, why didn't he hide the murder weapons?
He hid the murder weapon so well, but the money he left around, that didn't make any sense. So there's inconsistencies in how the case was put together, but there was enough evidence to convict him.
There was clearly enough evidence to convict him because he was the lodger, he was unemployed, nobody liked the way he looked, he needed the money, he was in arrears, he knew where her money was, and he was the kind of person who was not going to say, you people must be nuts and I'm going to prove it. He didn't fight back. He was very passive, very jelly-like, almost.
Well, it didn't help. He was also a poet.
Oh, yes.
There's that wonderful scene in which he's trying to talk to Poirot and he just kind of drifts off because he must be thinking about something. He must be thinking about a metaphor and he just couldn't focus very well.
Yes, he did not make a good impression in the jury box. And that was the other thing that Superintendent Spence noticed, that Bentley didn't have the cockiness that he associated with murderers. Bentley just didn't have the right kind of personality to do this kind of a crime, and most especially not being able to find the murder weapon, which was apparently some kind of a hatchet or hammer or something larger and heavier, but not typical, and they couldn't find it. Right. Why could they find everything else so incredibly easily, but not this? He worked at it and worked at it and worked at it to make sure he was absolutely right about who had murdered Mrs. McGinty and could not figure it out, and so he went to Poirot when he couldn't do anything else because the verdict had come in. James Bentley was guilty of murdering Mrs. McGinty and would have to be hung, and he had to get the evidence as quickly as possible, and that meant Hercule Poirot. And by the way, the two men do know each other. Poirot met Superintendent Spence earlier in the novel Taken at the Flood, but that's where he met Superintendent Spence, and so you see a little bit more of him here as you did in the earlier movie. So they do already know each other.
Right, so Poirot is sent alone to the village of Broadhenny, and we've talked about how well these episodes have been shot, but I think whoever did this, the director Ashley Pierce, really went out of his way to emphasize Poirot's isolation and alienation from the surroundings, because there's a lovely scene at the very beginning where he's standing in the town square, camera's focused down on him, and there's leaves in the background that are skittering across. It's not your typical summer England.
Yes, for a change, we are not on a sunny June day. It's always noticeable when you're not on a sunny June day in a Poirot, and in this case, you're not. And Poirot is having to stay at the only place in town, and that is Summerhays, and that is the mansion is called Longmeadows. It's the Summerhays family. Maureen and her husband, Johnny, the major. Johnny Summerhays' family has owned that house for the last 300 or 400 years. They are the grandest family in the district, and they live essentially in dire poverty. The only asset they have is the house, and so they are renting it out to PGs, that is paying guests, and they want the money up front, please, because they really need it, and they are really struggling. And part of the reason that they're struggling is that neither of them actually know how to run a household or run an estate, run a farm, deal with animals, deal with the basic cooking and cleaning. Maureen is completely incompetent. She was never taught how to do any of this. This is what you have servants for.
Right, you have terrible cooking, you have drafts in the room. There's a lovely scene in which Poirot is trapped in the parlor with
a big dog looking at him. The dog disapproves. And the very handsome dog, looked like an Irish setter, I thought. Beautiful red dog.
It didn't really look very threatening when it showed up there.
But it's a big dog, and it depends on how you feel about great big dogs with great big mouths full of teeth, forests of teeth. And you think, okay, puppy, you don't want me to move, so I'll just stand right here, and I am not going to move.
Right. So this is a gray and grim place with gray and grim people. And even that's one of the changes you noticed from the novels, that the Summerhays, they were a loving couple in the book. And
they had children too, by the way. And one of the things I always notice in Agatha Christie's, whether it's in the novel people tend to have children, although frequently they don't. But in the films, unless the children actually play a critical part in the role, they're one of the first characters to get cut. And I guess the idea is that you don't have to pay child actors on the set. But it really makes it seem very strange, as though this is an entirely adult world where there are no kids at all. You start getting into that Children of Men thing. That's the Ruth Rendell...
P.D. James novel.
Oh, P.D. James, sorry. That's the P.D. James novel about nobody's able to have children anymore, and so you have a dying culture. And we're going to watch that eventually, folks, when we get around to science fiction movies.
Mm-hmm. So we have a number of family members. We have the Summerhays here. We have Dr. and Mrs. Rendell.
With a suspicious past.
We have Bessie Birch and Joe Birch.
And they are another angry fighting couple. That Bessie Birch is actually Mrs. McGinty's niece. And Joe Birch is her husband. And again, the film made all of these people more unpleasant than they were in the novel. Joe Birch was a working class man. He was suspicious of outsiders. He and Bessie had a hard time. I cannot remember if they had children in the novel or if they had already grown up, but she was very happy to inherit some money and to inherit the house. But they didn't move into her aunt's house. They had a house of their own. But the film makes them a fighting couple, just like it makes Maureen and Johnny Summerhays an angry fighting couple fighting over money. And Joe Birch suddenly has to become, of course, an adulterer. But again, you're trying to simplify the plot for a purpose of a 1 hour and 33-minute movie, and so we do what we must.
Right. And then we have the Carpenters, Eve and Guy. And this is, again, another one of Agatha Christie's. Guy Carpenter is a member of Parliament and a politician. And it seems like every time she inserts a politician, it's a deeply unpleasant politician.
He is not a pleasant man. Again, the film simplified his character a little bit because in the novel, he is much more interested in putting on a good front because his constituents need it. And you kind of get the impression in the novel that he doesn't know about his gorgeous, hot cookie wife's sordid past as a taxi dancer, and also as an unofficial wife is actually the term that Agatha used, in addition to being a taxi dancer. And for those of you who don't know, if you remember the old song about 10 cents a dance, that's what a taxi dancer was. A taxi dancer made her money at dance halls by dancing with men for 10 cents a dance. She was not a prostitute, but if she really needed the money and she felt comfortable going home with you, well, you'd get laid and she'd get paid.
Yeah, think of it as paid lap dances.
Yes, very, very similar, except that you're upright and you wear more clothes. But his wife was a taxi dancer and an unofficial widow, according to Superintendent Spence. Again, this is a post-war novel. One of the things Superintendent Spence mentions is how, as a result of the war, people were able to completely redo their background and move someplace else. And with all of the destruction of records, you had no idea where someone went or what happened to them. And this is important because they are looking for several women who had been involved in murder years before. A trope that Agatha is using here is old sins have long shadows. And we're looking at a modern murder, Mrs. McGinty. Is it related to a murder that happened 20 years ago? Of course it is.
Well, let's go. We have one more couple, Robin and Mrs. Upward.
But I wasn't finished with the Carpenters because,
go ahead then.
See, this is what I thought. Again, they have to consolidate for the film. In the novel, Guy Carpenter, I don't think, knew that his wife was a taxi dancer and somebody's unofficial wife. But in the film, it's very clear because she has her old showgirl bills standing around
in Soho.
If you are a serious politician, particularly in that day and age, because remember, this film is set in about 1936, 1937, and an up-and-coming MP who is ambitious is not going to marry a stripper because you will not get elected. Even in London, you are not going to become elected to any kind of party office with a wife with that kind of questionable background. And I thought that was a flaw. I understand why they did it, because they needed the shorthand. But he wouldn't have married her, no matter how hot she was. It wouldn't have mattered, especially one that you could find out about it easily.
So we end with the Upwards, and this involves the subplot involving Ariadne Oliver.
Yes, and Ariadne is always fun to watch. Zoe Wanamaker does a really wonderful job as Ariadne. She nearly runs down Poirot. She beans him with an apple core because, of course, she's always eating apples. She is in Broad Hinny for a completely unrelated reason, and that is she is having to convert her Sven Hjergerson novel into a play for London's West End.
Yes.
This is not just Agatha enjoying herself by making Ariadne her foil, but commenting on the playwriting process, because Agatha herself had to put up with all kinds of shenanigans from playwrights wanting to convert her novels into plays, which is why she started writing them herself. Because the playwright would say, "Oh, but Sven needs to have a love interest. He's 60. Oh, he needs to be skiing 50 miles in order to rescue the damsel. He's 60. He needs to be more of a red-blooded man. He's a vegetarian. We need sexual tension between Sven and Ingrid. He's 60, and he's never had sex in his life. Oh, Ariadne, darling, you don't understand how plays work.
And this is something that Agatha experienced with one of her early plays that starred Charles Laughton as Poirot, called Alibi, which was based on the murder of Roger Ackroyd. And she had to fight, and she succeeded in doing so, to keep them from turning Poirot into a younger character named Beau Poirot.
Beau? As in Beauregard?
As in Beauregard, or Beau Jest, or whatever.
Oh, my God. Probably Beauregard.
And having lots of girls in love with him.
Oh, my God. With Poirot, maybe when he was a handsome young man on the Belgian police force 50 years prior. But no, I understand Agatha's feelings perfectly. And you can see her amused frustration in the text. And it comes out here, too, because there's Ariadne having to deal with Robin Upward, who has no interest whatsoever in actually listening to the novelist. Why should he listen to the real writer? He's a playwright and he knows better what's going to go on stage. And maybe he does. Yeah. Maybe he does. But if he really wants to have a character do those things, he should write his own damn characters and not try to adapt hers. Mm-hmm. So Ariadne is there, stuck with Robin and Mrs. Upward. And Robin and his mother have a really interesting, strange relationship. When you watch carefully, it really doesn't seem like mother and son. He always refers to her as madre, which is Latin for mother. And it's more like a courtier, a companion than a mother and son. She expects him to do things. She expects him to wait on her. It's not a sexual relationship. Mm-hmm. Don't think that. If you're thinking of Lady Tamplin and Corky in The Mystery of the Blue Train, it is not that kind of a relationship. Yeah. But Robin, he's not really her son. He calls her that, and everyone assumes that she is. But it's an odd relationship, more like a patron and her protege.
So we have that. There's also one more character we should talk about, Maud Williams.
Maud works at the real estate office. They're called house agents in England. She works at the real estate office, and she happened to know James Bentley, and you're not really sure why she's attracted to him. And it isn't really spelled out in either the text or in the film, but you realize at the end why she's interested. But she does not feel that James Bentley murdered Mrs. McGinty. And when Poirot shows up in town to do the investigation, she is very happy to help. As a house agent, she pries into the rich people's homes because, of course, she can go in with her clipboard and say, I'm doing a survey about the best houses in the district. And, of course, people fall all over themselves to let her walk around and open drawers and snoop in dressers. And that's what Mrs. McGinty did. And that's why, in fact, Maud is doing kind of the same thing that Mrs. McGinty did. Mrs. McGinty liked to snoop. And now Maud is snooping to find out why Mrs. McGinty was murdered as a result of her snooping.
Right. So what Poirot does, he's investigating Mrs. McGinty's past. There's all kinds of material that she left behind in a suitcase. And he discovers a newspaper with the center portion cut out.
About that time, he also is asking questions, and he discovers from the postmistress, Miss Sweetyman, that Mrs. McGinty did something out of character, something so strange that Miss Sweetyman commented on it to Poirot, and it took him a little while to understand this because this is a class difference. Mrs. McGinty bought a bottle of ink. Now, why would she buy a bottle of ink? Well, to write letters, of course, but she is not the kind of woman who writes letters. See, Poirot, he writes letters by the bushel. Ariadne Oliver, she buys her ink by the barrel. The higher up the food chain you are, the more likely you are to be literate enough that you write a lot of letters. You receive a lot of letters. But for Mrs. McGinty, buying a bottle of ink was a momentous occasion, something worthy of notice, and that tells Poirot that she had a reason to write a letter. Why did she write a letter? And then he discovers the newspaper with the cutout in the middle of it in her sad little suitcase filled with the sad remnants of her life, and he ends up at the girl reporter's office at the Sunday Comet, and that is Pamela Horsfell, and he asks her about the article, which is about 2 women murderesses. Where are they now? And she says, how should I know? I made up all that stuff.
And again, you get a very contemptuous look at people looking at a certain class, because almost all the people in the town of Broadhenny looked down at Mrs. McGinty. Even the member of Parliament, Guy Carpenter, could not hide his distaste. Why should I pay attention to what she says? even I think it was Robin Upward or was it Robin who was listening to her talk? There was one of the other characters who was listening to her talk. Oh no, it was I'm sorry, it was James Bentley.
James Bentley didn't really listen to what she had to say, because she was, as several of the characters have said, who does it really matter who killed her? She was just a char.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very elitist attitude. I think it's a very human attitude, because as soon as people get any kind of money at all and they're able to lord it over someone else, they do, which is why Eve Carpenter, taxi dancer and stripper, refers to Mrs. McGinty, oh, she's just a char. Well, if Eve Carpenter hadn't gotten lucky and married a rich man, eventually she would be on her hands and knees scrubbing other people's floors too, because you can only be a taxi dancer and a stripper when you're young and hot. When you're 60 years old, if you haven't put your money by carefully, you're on your knees scrubbing floors.
So Poirot tracks down the original article and talks to the reporter, of course. So we have pictures of two women, one the 11-year-old girl that looks very frumpy in glasses, and the other a beautiful woman.
Eva Kane, she was Mr. Craig's nursery governess, and she and Mr. Craig fell madly in love. The film doesn't go into a lot of detail on this, but there is a lot of suspicion in the police department, according to Superintendent Spence, who looked into it for Poirot once he discovered the newspaper clipping, and from Pamela Horsfall, girl reporter, that Eva Kane was not the sweet, innocent, put-upon damsel seduced by her employer, and then he murdered his wife so that he could have her. No, she was active every step of the way, and she might have been the one who poisoned Mrs. Craig, and then Mr. Craig covered it up and was hung in her place in order to save her. And Lily Gamble, as well, has a more jaundiced view on the part of the newspaper reporter and the police that she was an unpleasant child and probably did not turn out well. And in fact, they kind of imply in the film that she didn't turn out well because she's now in prison in Ireland for having taken a meat chopper to her husband the way she took a meat chopper to her aunt when she was 10 years old.
So Poirot investigating these pasts and trying to find out who in the village is related to these women.
Yes, and he shows photographs. He has photographs, the ones that appeared in the Daily Comet. Mrs. Upward sees the pictures, and she is the one who admits, I recognize the picture, and she points to the picture of Lily Gamble.
And this was at a party, so all the suspects are watching her.
Yes, everybody is there getting drunk, and of course this leads to later on angry words between a wide variety of the participants in the party, because how dare you, and you spend all the money, and you don't know what you're doing, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da.
So Mrs. Upward says, I recognize one of these, and she points to the picture of the child killer, Lily. But Poirot has come to understand that she was laying down a false trail because she didn't want to be known. But she points to Lily when she really meant to point at the older woman, at the beautiful lady.
To Eva Kane. And the reason why Mrs. Upward did this, she wants control. She likes control, and she wants to work out for herself what her response is going to be, because she is realizing that what she believed is not true. Again, the film had to really truncate this, but in the novel there is some detail about the relationship between Robin and Mrs. Upward, and in fact, when Ariadne and Robin Upward go off to see a play, the fateful night when they leave Madre alone, Ariadne hears a conversation about Mrs. Upward and her previous charming young man, where she discovered that this young man claimed to be the son of somebody important, and he had fallen on hard times, and she wanted a protege, and when she discovered that he was lying to her, she dumped him. And this is where Poirot later on uses the phrase, probably going to pronounce it incorrectly because it's French, a Peschel secret. And this is based on a 1903 French play, and basically it means it's a secret that everybody inside the circle knows, and so they don't feel the need to talk about it because everybody knows and they've already hashed out all the details. But if you are outside the circle, you don't know, but the people inside the circle assume that because they all know, you know this fact too. So we do not see. It does give you a little bit of the feeling of Poirot pulling the solution out of his boutonniere vase, because you don't see any kind of a scene where Ariadne says, oh, and tells Poirot, or Poirot says, oh, this is the answer. And the answer is, of course, that Robin Upward is not Mrs. Upward's son. He is her protege. And they're telling people that he is her son, and part of it is probably so that people on the outside do not look at the relationship and think, oh, she's paying him to service her, the randy old bag.
I especially enjoyed when you looked at Mrs. Upward and you said, "That's Livia from I, Claudius." And it turned out you were right. The scheming Livia made such an impression on you at a younger age, and apparently she still got it.
Yes, she's still got it. And yes, this is the kind of person that if Robin Upward was in her household, not described to everyone as her son, every single person would say, oh my God, that randy old bag, she is paying this young man to service her, and I hope he closes his eyes.
Yep.
But then all cats are gray in the dark anyway, so.
When they left for the play, it's implied after the fact that Mrs. Upward called 3 of the women who were of the right age
to be Eva Kane.
To call them over and see which one is the right one, I guess. And there's implications that she was going to blackmail them.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, not to be Eva Kane. There's suspicion that Mrs. Upward is Eva Kane, but those 3 women are the right age to be Eva Kane's illegitimate daughter with Craig. Only one of them admits to coming over to the house because only one of them did, and that's Maureen Summerhays, and nobody answered the door. Mrs. Rendell was asleep in the arms of Prince Valium because her husband gives her heavy-duty drugs. She has mental issues. And Eve Carpenter was, why should I go visit that nasty, randy old bag? I'm not going to see her. Eve is not going to be a good politician's wife on the campaign trail. You can see this one coming.
Well, Guy doesn't seem to be very good at what he does either. You don't talk down your constituents to anybody because people talk.
I think that is a flaw. I really do. I understand why people do that in terms of writing scripts, but it shows that the script writer is using too much shorthand and not paying attention to the way people actually would behave.
So we find out that Mrs. Upward is strangled.
And it was very obvious that a woman did it because there's the coffee cup with the lipstick print right there, which, of course, by this time, even in 1937, when the Poirot episodes are set, every person who had ever read a detective novel would have immediately wiped off, with the strangulation scarf, by the way, would have wiped off the lipstick. Right. And the air is simply saturated with perfume, so you almost can't avoid, oh my God, a woman was here, drank coffee with Mrs. Upward, and then strangled her with her own scarf. And it is, of course, a stage setting.
Yeah.
It is a stage setting.
Yeah, it was too obvious.
It was too obvious.
Absolutely too obvious. And it makes sense that Poirot would see it that way. If you're going to strangle somebody with your scarf, you don't leave behind the evidence that is so obvious. You may not recognize the perfume, but you certainly see the lipstick. Oh,
yes. You would look at that coffee cup and say, I need to take that cup away with me. How hard would it have been to take that cup away with me? And when something like that is left sitting out, it might as well be shouting, clue, 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 look at me, I'm a piece of important evidence.
That's right.
And I mean, that's why the police, when they do forensics, they go over there with magnifying glasses and tweezers looking for little bitty things like dropped hairs or skin flakes or, dusting everything for fingerprints. They don't expect to find a coffee cup with lipstick smeared on it because everybody reads detective stories and knows better.
Well, we learned several things by this time, of course. We learned that the murder weapon was not a hatchet, it wasn't a meat chopper, but it was something called a sugar hammer, which we find in the Summerhays' house. Poirot finds it sitting there on the desk in its little
container.
And he's not surprised that it's out in the study because, of course, Maureen is such a slattern that she probably puts food everywhere and doesn't clean up after herself. She puts stuff
everywhere. She doesn't use a sugar hammer, but she bought it at the jumble sale because she liked the way it looked.
And it was an amazing piece of equipment.
If you've never seen a sugar hammer, it's worth looking up on Google Images, an antique sugar hammer, because sugar used to come in big solid rocks,
loaves,
not granulated. What you had to do was take your special hammer, and the richer you were, the nicer your hammer was, and it had a hammer at one end and kind of like an axe blade at the other, a small one, made out of bronze, something that you could clean easily, and you would break off chunks of sugar with your sugar hammer. And sugar was very expensive, and so, of course, the tools that you use to get at your sugar lump, would be equally nice and equally expensive and equally decorative. This is a decorative hatchet. Maureen Summerhays has it on the desk in the parlor where Poirot is staying. She doesn't think anything of it. Oh yes, I got that at the jumble sale. When did I get that at the jumble sale? Maybe it was Christmas. But as it turns out, he finds out came from Mrs. Rendell that it didn't work in their decor.
That's
and Mrs.
right.
Rendell said, we got rid of it in the October jumble. And Maureen couldn't remember. And Poirot has to decide who is more likely to be accurate. And the answer is easy. It's going to be the doctor's wife and not Maureen Summerhays. Mm-hmm. And he immediately packages up the sugar hammer. He recognizes that, wow, this is the perfect weapon for killing someone, and it matches the forensic details on Mrs. McGinty's skull. And he sends it off, and of course there are microscopic blood traces on it. It had been washed, but not well enough.
And then he also discovers the photograph of Eva in the desk of Maureen Summerhays' house.
Yes. It could possibly be Maureen because she was adopted. She is angry about being abandoned by her mother and being adopted. But Poirot happens to know that when he had put the contents of the drawer back earlier, there had been no photograph. And now when Maureen came racing in, trying to find something that she had completely misplaced because she doesn't follow the adage, a place for everything and everything in its place, that there's the photograph. How did the photograph get there? There weren't that many people parading in and out of the house. And remember, Robin Upward writes plays. He understands stage setting. He understands setting up a scene. He can act.
But also he moved into the Summerhays' house after Mrs. Upward was killed because he couldn't stay in the house.
Yes,
and
he was too delicate.
Hear him typing upstairs, and this is the final clue that says that it was the playwright Robin Upward who killed Mrs. Upward and therefore Mrs. McGinty.
And that is indeed who it was. It was Robin Upward.
It also hinged on the idea that the name Evelyn is a boy's name as well as a girl's name, because they said that the child was named Evelyn, but it could apply to a boy as well. So Robin Upward was really Evelyn.
Evelyn Hope.
Evelyn Hope, that's it.
And this is a little tiny hint also at the kind of person Eva Kane was, that she named her son after herself, because her name was Eva, but that could be very easily short for Evelyn. Mm-hmm. And she changed her name to Hope, and so she moves to Australia and has her illegitimate baby and names him Evelyn Hope after herself, because what is the closest boy's name to Eva? Evelyn. Right. Even though that is not a name that you will ever hear given to a boy anymore, anywhere in the universe.
But at the time, there was a famous writer, Evelyn Waugh.
And for years I thought that was a woman. I did. It's like Jocelyn as a man's name, and yet Jocelyn used to be a man's name. So did Florence, Leslie. Sydney is well on its way to no longer being a man's name. And of course, Poirot swings back to the original newspaper story, which is that Eva Kane was quoted in the newspaper as, "My daughter is never going to know about the terrible things that happened to me." And he thinks back to Pamela Horsfeld, the reporter, and she said, "I have no idea. I write that, I make that crap up."
Right.
And he realizes the only reason anybody thinks that Eva Kane's child was a girl is because the newspaper article said so. But nobody actually knew because she didn't have the baby until she went to Australia.
And we get this wonderful scene at the end in which Robin is confronted with the evidence and Poirot breaks him down. And it was this very satisfying ending, I thought.
And then you also find out one of the reasons why Maud Williams afterwards was interested in clearing James Bentley's name. And again, there's a lot more detail in the novel. Remember, Eva Kane was the Craig's nursery governess, and that means that there were children. Maud Williams, after her mother was murdered and her father was hung, she was sent with her younger sibling to Australia to live with relatives. And she always knew Eva Kane killed her mother. She knew Eva Kane had murdered her mother. She had tracked down Robin Upward. She knew they were in Broadhenny. She thought that Mrs. Upward was Eva Kane. She didn't know that she wasn't, but she knew who Robin Upward was. She knew he was Evelyn Hope. She was one of the people who actually did show up at the house when Robin Upward and Ariadne were off at the play. She walked into the house ready to confront and then shoot Mrs. Upward because how dare she murder her mother, and she discovers her body and she walks back out and realizes that she has been saved from murder because somebody else got there first. And I thought that that was a very good ending because it reminds you that murders are not clean, they're not mess-free, that you leave a lot of grief and anger behind because, of course, the children of the Craigs, Dad is hung for murdering Mom because of that hussy nursery governess. You were angry forever. You didn't grow up with your mother, and your father was hung by the crown. You're going to be angry. And Maud Williams was angry enough to uproot herself from her entire life, track down where Evelyn Hope went, end up in Broadhinny, and then she sees the nice man who worked at the real estate agent with her. He wasn't very good at it, but she liked him. Mm-hmm. She liked him. He's being accused of murder, and she can't imagine why he would do this when there is such a much better suspect right over there. And so she helps Poirot solve the murder.
And Poirot confronts her with it, and she says, what are you going to do now that you know who I am? And he just says,
nothing.
Not so much nothing. He just says, he's waiting for you. Bon chance.
Yes, and we see Maud Williams go up the steps of the courthouse to see James Bentley being released.
And that's the story.
That's the story of
Mrs. McGinty's dead.
I thought it was a really good episode. Not one of their best, but certainly not down there in the weeds, along with Appointment with Death and The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. This is a very good episode. It is well worth watching. If you've seen the Margaret Rutherford version, you have not seen Mrs. McGinty's Dead.
But you should still see that because it's still an amusing.
Oh, it's fun. They make a lot more of the plays and playwrights and the play within a play. You get almost none of that here. They really ran with that concept in Murder Most Foul.
Yeah, and she ends up infiltrating an acting company by auditioning with The Murder of Sam McGee. Was the Robert W. Service poem. She just gives a lusty performance of it, and they had to have her in the company. They had to have her,
especially because she was also going to put money into the production.
Yep, that's true.
And one last thing before we go, Bill and I are going to be participating in Romance Bookstore Day. This is actually an entire weekend of activities. Our local bookstore, Cupboard Maker Books in Enola, is sponsoring it, and they're going to have erotica authors Friday night, which is not me. They're going to have a wide variety of authors all day Saturday, not including me. My turn is going to come on Sunday, the 21st of August, 2022, and I'll be at Cupboard Maker Books from 11 to 1. So if you want to come out and meet me as Odessa Moon, that's where I'll be.
And now we come to the end of another episode of Agatha Christie, She Watched. Next time, we're going to be looking at Cat Among the Pigeons?
Cat Among the Pigeons. Oh, and I do review all of the movies we see on our website. So if you want to see other of my thoughts, just go to peschelpress.com.
This is Bill Peschel.
And Teresa Peschel, and thanks for joining us.
Agatha Christie, She Watched is Teresa Peschel and Bill Peschel. Produced by Bill Peschel. Theme song, Call to Adventure by Kevin MacLeod. New episodes come out every week wherever you stream your content. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can help support us by going to anchor.fm/mystery and leaving a 5-star rating and review, and by helping to spread the word. To advertise on Mystery She Watched, email Peschel at peschelpress.com. All questions and comments can be emailed to Peschel at peschelpress.com. And thank you for listening.